Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Moses Kotane Institute virtual lecture on a Thursday. My name is Bongiwe Chulai. I'm the Manager Innovation at the Moses Kotane Institute. Today we are bringing to you South Africa's Fiscal Challenges lecture, brought to us by Dr. Aza Yamin, Director and a Chief Economist of Econometrics Pty Ltd in South Africa. Econometrics is a leading independent economic research consultancy forecasting company. It was established as far back as 1982. Dr. Aza Yamin has been in his current position since December 1985 and has established a significant profile in South Africa as an analyst, commentator on domestic and international economic affairs. He has conducted more than 5,000 presentations to leading client corporations and other institutions, as well as conferences dealing with the local and international economic environment. In his capacity, he has also been invited over the years by several corporations to serve as an independent non-executive director. Dr. Yamin recently retired as a member of the National Advisory Council on Innovation, a body of experts appointed by the Department of Science and Technology, but still assist in NACI on ad hoc basis as an expert on various tasks. Academically, he obtained BSc honors in mathematical statistics and BA honors in economics at the University of the Witwatersrand, followed by MSc in economics from LSE and a PhD at the London Business School. The Moses Kotane is very excited to have Dr. Aza Yamin giving this lecture today. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Bongi, and thank you very much for the honor of addressing your institute, and to all those who are tuning in here. It's a delight to be with you. The topic that I chose is fiscal challenges because it's clearly one of the important and focal points of our economic analysis these days. Because the big danger that currently exists in South Africa is that government debt is seemingly on its way to running out of control. And I thought it was kind of valid to try and explain what has been going on in this regard to your support. If you go on to the next slide, you can see this is the long-term history of South Africa's economic growth. And what you do notice is that from around 2007 onwards, the South African economy was in a long declining trend of economic growth, to the point that where during the second half of last year through the first quarter of this year, before the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, we were already in a recession with negative growth. The situation's actually a little more serious when you bear in mind that the population is growing at 1.5% per year. So even a zero economic growth rate means that on average, living standards are declining by 1.5% per year. So there were clearly problems that caused the economic growth rate to decline progressively over that 13-year period. But of course, nothing prepared us for the kind of knock that has taken place as a result of the lockdowns that had to be introduced to fight the COVID-19 crisis. And clearly, the one very detrimental effect of these lockdowns and the slowdown in economic growth was that the government has had to see a quarter of its tax revenue falling away, which means that it has to borrow all the additional money if it wants to be able to keep expenditure, keep control of expenditure. Let me show the next slide, please. You will see here that fortunately, if you look down the column 2020, you will notice that the forecast growth rates by the International Monetary Fund, for example, for South Africa this year at -8% is a terrible outcome, but it is still not the worst in the world. areas such as the Eurozone and the United Kingdom and India, those economies are set to contract even more than our economy. However, what you do notice is that if you look at 2019, the economic growth that we achieved of 0.2% was in fact the third weakest of the leading economies of the world after Argentina and Mexico. So clearly, yes, we can derive some consolation from the fact that the downturn in economic growth this year has not been worse than others, and that we've been equally hammered by the COVID-19 crisis. But the bad news is that we were amongst the weakest economies in the run-up to the COVID crisis. And unless we address some of the key structural weaknesses that led to that decline in our economic growth, come the end of the crisis, we will not be able to see the kind of recovery that most other economies are seeing. At present, the general expectation is that in South Africa and in the rest of the world, there is going to be a nice recovery off a very low base next year. But clearly, if you go down by 8% and then you recover by 3 or 3.5%, the ones in red were the old forecast made in June, you're still going to be well behind where you were when you went into the crisis in the first year. Now, why is everyone so optimistic that next year will be a little better than this year? The first and most recent reason is because we have seen the development of new vaccines. However, a second reason is that governments around the world and their central banks embarked upon an unprecedented stimulus, fiscal stimulus. Their governments started spending like crazy, despite the fact that government revenues were falling because of lower economic growth. And the net effect has been an extraordinary escalation in public debt to GDP ratios around the world. In advanced economies, for example, the IMF is now projecting the ratio of public debt to GDP to rise to 131%. At the beginning of the year, they were saying only 105%. For emerging markets, there's also been an increase from 56% to 63% projection of public debt. Now, you might ask, well, why is it that the leading economies of the world can spend their way out of trouble that way, whereas the emerging markets have been more restricted, including South Africa, are more restricted in their ability to do so? And this very simple reason is that emerging markets, that advanced economies, next slide, have adopted an unprecedented accommodative monetary policy. Their central banks have been buying up government debt like never before, and added around $10 trillion to the world economy in the past 9 months. You can see how the US money supply has just soared ahead. And that has helped to drive down long-term interest rates in advanced economies to close to zero, and in the case of the Eurozone and Japan, to even negative levels, where people who lend the government's money are actually paying them to lend the money. Whereas in emerging markets like South Africa, we are sitting with very handsome high interest rates that cost us dearly if we have a lot of debt in the form of higher interest costs. And that is the big problem that a country like South Africa faces when it sees a deterioration in its fiscal situation. Next slide. As things stand now, you can see that these are the various forecasts for economic growth this year made by different bodies. I showed you the one of the IMF right at the top, but you can see more generally, people are looking for somewhere between -7 and -8.5%, the exception of the OECD, and a recovery of somewhere to between 2.5% and 5% for next year, which is year. The real problem is what follows after 2021. And this is where we start running into the dangers of the kind of fiscal situation that we're in. Next slide. And now to get to the problem, immediately. You'll notice, for example, that the forecast by the National Treasury has had to be revised downwards dramatically as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. When the government formulated its budget in February 2020, it forecast economic growth of 0.9%. But what we can see is that since then, there has been a dramatic deterioration as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. But you can see that as a result of the dramatic downward revision of economic growth as a result of the COVID-19 crisis from plus 0.9% to minus 7.3%, we are now, next slide, seeing, I cannot see my slides, unfortunately. We can see a massive shortfall in government revenue this year compared with what we had budgeted for at the beginning of the year. For the last 7 years, as the economy's growth has been declining, the growth in government revenues have fallen behind what was budgeted for every single year. But nothing as dramatic as this massive shortfall in tax revenues as a result of the contraction in growth this year. Next slide. The result has been that the shortfall between what government borrows, what government spends, and what it receives in taxes has had to be revised upwards massively to nearly 16% of GDP. And that's the base from which we have to carry on for the next couple of years. And you can see these huge deficits. In other words, the gap between what is being spent and what government receives in taxes has just widened enormously. And that money has to be borrowed. Next slide. As a result, we are now seeing a huge increase in the public debt to GDP ratio. If you go back in time to 2008-09, you can see that that ratio was just 21.8% in the final year of Trevor Manuel as Minister of Finance. And ever since then, it has just escalated, but with a stepwise massive increase in the current year, set to continue through the next few years. Carry on. Now, this is a major problem, because if it continues like that, then the interest that government has to pay on that debt will crowd out its ability to spend on anything else, such including education, skills, development, innovation, healthcare, whatever. What the COVID-19 crisis, of course, did was government was forced to spend an enormous amount of extra money on debt relief, on COVID relief measures, but at the same time had this collapse in government revenue, resulting in what Finance Minister Tito Mboweni called the opening of the mouth of a hippopotamus. Now, the only way to try and close that is to close that hippopotamus's mouth, both by improving economic growth and getting more revenue, or by reducing government spending quite massively. And that is now the government's new budgetary plan. Next slide. If we look at now you can see where we've come from. This was the forecast of public debt to GDP. Remember, back in 2008, it was 1.8%. By 2017, it was 50.5%. By the forecast was that would rise to 63% this year and go on to 72% by 2023. That was the forecast made in February 2019. But then, since then, economic growth has fallen behind what government budgeted for every time, and that means government revenue has collapsed, and so government has had to borrow still more. And even with the closing of that massive mouth of the hippopotamus, this is the latest trajectory that the government is now forecasting for public debt to GDP. In June, it did a forecast which was there, but that forecast was based on economic growth of -7% instead of -7.8%. Then in October, with a medium-term budget policy statement, the growth forecast was expanded, or the contraction was reforecast to be -7.8%. That's almost 1% bigger contraction than we had anticipated even in June. And that meant having to expect even less taxes and a more borrowing requirement. Now, what is the option that the government has? Either to close the mouth of that hippopotamus and get to this trajectory, which at least peaks at a ratio of 95.3% by 2026, or to do nothing, in which case the government debt level ratios would just expand extraordinarily to 141% of GDP by 2028. Now, you did see me earlier show you how for advanced economies, debt levels were already expected to rise to 131% of GDP. But the difference is that our long-term interest rates are anywhere between 8 and 10%, whereas for advanced economies, they are just 0 to 1%, because investors have so much more confidence in them, they are willing to lend them money at virtually no interest, whereas in South Africa's case, because of their lack of confidence in our economic outlook, they are demanding 9% to compensate for that risk. Next slide. So what is the heart of the efforts of the government to try and close that hippopotamus's mouth? And it is really to be found in this top line here, where you see it accounts for around 40% of government spending, compensation of public servants. The forecast on which the budget is now based is 0 growth in public service remuneration in the coming fiscal year, 1.2% growth in the following fiscal year, and 1.3% in the year thereafter. In other words, that's virtually a freeze on public sector wages. And currently, there is a big standoff in the courts of law between public sector unions and the government, because public sector unions say, especially with regard to this figure, that the government is reneging on a promise that it made 3 years ago to continue granting inflationary increases to public servants. And now they are saying no increases in rand terms whatsoever. And in the face of an expected inflation rate of around 4 to 4.5% over the next few years, this kind of increase in public sector remuneration implies a real reduction every year of around 3 to 4% in the purchasing power that public servants have through their wages. Next slide. And that's fairly dramatic, and but unless it does that, you can already see how debt servicing costs, interest payments on the debt that government has incurred, is already set to increase by 16.1% per year. And that is already crowding out its ability to spend on learning and culture, due to grow by 1.1% per year, on healthcare 2.9%, and on economic development 4.6%, on social development 2.1%. But interest payments are already set to increase by 16.1%. Next slide. And the deterioration in the case of South Africa has been that much greater than in any of the other main emerging markets. Slide. The result is that international investors are demanding a higher premium to lend money to the South African government than to any of these other governments. Our inflation rate currently is 3.3%. The average 10-year interest rate is 8.9%. So the real long-term interest rate in South Africa is 5.6%, which means that the South African government is paying proportionately more interest than any other leading economy to borrow money. And yet the amount of its borrowings are surging ahead at an unprecedented rate. Next slide. As a result, credit ratings agencies are getting frightened that in a few years' time, the government will no longer be able to pay the interest on its debt. And this is why we have seen a progressive and in most recently a big downgrade in the credit ratings on South African government bonds by the leading credit rating agencies. And this may not seem particularly negative, but one of the characteristics of credit ratings is the lower the credit rating, the higher the interest rate that governments have to offer to investors to buy the debt that they need to borrow. Next slide. And one of the effects is that in the past year, a year ago, our short-term interest rates were around 7% and our long-term interest rates were 9%. Today, we're looking at short-term interest rates of 3.5%. The Reserve Bank has slashed our repo rate, but long-term interest rates of 9 to 10%. And that's a very unhealthy situation. It is causing all sorts of distortion, one of which is, for example, that banks are very happy to sit on their money and invest it in, lend the money to government at 9 and 10%, rather than to lend it out to private individuals and businesses at 3%, because they make a lot more money by investing in government bonds. And that is then denying the corporate sector and the private individuals the ability to borrow money more readily than would otherwise have been the case. And so economic growth lags behind. Next slide. Now, there have been some developments. Can you go to the next slide and then move back on? At the heart of, I mentioned that the economy should recover next year post-COVID, and that, but the fear that we have is that if we don't address the very reasons why economic growth had declined so sharply over a decade, we will not be able to generate enough government revenue, tax revenue, to try and put an end to this deterioration in our fiscal situation. And I've listed here about 10 different factors that are standing in the way of the economy growing faster. Corruption and state capture, policy uncertainty surrounding things like land expropriation without compensation, nationalization of the Reserve Bank, uncertainty regarding the introduction of broadband spectrum, the proposed introduction of a national health insurance scheme that many regard as being unaffordable, making it very difficult for companies to get mining licenses. Then you've got the problems of state-owned enterprises, which are being run or until recently were being run very inefficiently and were the subject of a lot of state capture, and are now reliant on government bailouts to help them survive. Wasteful public sector expenditure, much of which we see from the Auditor General's report, a lot of irregular, unauthorized and wasteful expenditure. Insufficient infrastructural investment because of a lack of capacity and administrative, both administrative and technical capacity to implement such programs. Too little investment, too much consumption. You can't keep consuming and not investing back in the economy sufficiently. And at the heart of all this is the inadequacy of education and skills development. When you only get 1 out of every 40 students that begin school ending up with 60% or more for mathematics in matric, you really face a problem of skills shortages, especially in terms of innovative capacity and coping with the fourth industrial revolution. And part of the problem that we have is that there is far too much power concentrated in the hands of a government, large state-owned organizations, very large, big businesses, and very powerful trade unions. And that, coupled with a very burdensome regulatory environment, is stifling small business activity and entrepreneurship to innovate at a very low level. Go back one slide, please. Now, fortunately, in the last few months, we have seen some significant moves towards structural reform. There have been a lot of judicial action taken against perpetrators of corruption and crime. On the electricity price and state-owned enterprise front, we've had independent power producers being allowed, for the first time, being licensed to enter the electricity market to compete with Eskom in supplying electricity, and that should relieve some of the electricity shortage and bring about more competition and efficiency in electricity supply. There's access to mining licenses has been made a little easier by some of the alterations in the BEE clauses. We've had the announcement of a definite date for the auction of broadband spectrum, which should help reduce the cost of access to data and also access to information for a vast majority of people who have in this country who have found that very unaffordable of late. On land reform, we have seen government introducing a land expropriation without a compensation bill, as well as offering 770,000 hectares of underdeveloped state-owned agricultural land to emerging farmers. Government has sat with private sector in detailing 51 various different infrastructural investment projects with 340 billion rand, and the president has stated that he is committed to trying to improve the capacity of the state. And finally, in order to resolve some of the SOE weaknesses, President Ramaphosa spoke about attracting strategic equity partners to come in to help in managing and running and funding SOEs. Now, all that, if implemented, could see a reversal in the downward trend of South Africa's economy and an improvement in the country's ability to raise tax revenues in such a way as to gradually put an end to the rising trend of public debt. However, there is considerable skepticism by many as to whether we will see the light of day with many of these promises, partly on the basis that in the past we have seen a number of programs being put forward to try and address the structural weaknesses of the economy, but those have failed to be implemented. And there have been a number of developments most recently that have cast doubt on in businessmen's minds regarding the commitment to reforms, such as the failure of the ANC, despite having promised to do so, to take action to get people, officials within the organization who have been accused of corruption to resign. And we see that actually failing to be implemented in the cases of, for example, Bonani Bongi, Mike Mabuya Kulu, Ace Magashule, and the like. And then on top of that, we had the measure taken in the medium-term budget policy statement to allocate yet again 10.5 billion rand to South African Airways, notwithstanding the fact that the government is desperately short of money to fund education, healthcare, innovation, and that kind of program, because it's having to pay so much on interest payments on debt. That spoke to there being ideological imperatives amongst politicians that override the ability to actually implement what is really necessary in the form of structural reforms. So it is absolutely critical that the government starts addressing some of these issues. Failure to do so will mean that after an initial recovery in the economy over the next 6-9 months, the economy will slide back into a slump and not generate enough tax revenues to be able to meet its debt and interest payment commitments. And that in the long term, if we don't do that, we could be facing a major debt default with massive ramifications in terms of the potential impoverishment of society. So those are the challenges that the South African government faces. There have been some moves that give one a bit of hope, but then on the other hand, you've got a lot of skepticism as to whether these intentions will actually be implemented in practice. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much. Let's just check on the Q&A. Yes, there is one question. It says, should the banks not be invited to come to some kind of social contract with the government and put the country before profit? Should the banks not come into the party and have some social contract that, you know, put the country before they can actually make profit?
You know, it's easy to think in that sense, but the moment you go into a situation where you're trying to operate merely to, you know, just to try and satisfy society, I don't know that that provides enough incentive for banks, their leaders, and the people working for them to work hard to generate the kind of social improvements that are necessary. That's a classic example of, in many ways, why the economy, why too much government involvement in it just doesn't generate the results that one really wants. We saw the dramatic failure at the end of the day in the Soviet Union, where everyone was expected to work just for the government and forget about profit. And at the end of the day, there was just absolutely no incentive to be more productive, to innovate, and to advance economic growth through that measure.
Thank you very much. For me, I think the question is, so what for an average South African? What does this all mean for an average South African? How do I spend my money knowing very well that the interest rates are not favoring me, that there are not much investments coming at the country? If they do, they're coming at a high cost. As a public servant myself, zero increase on salaries for the next 3 years. What does that all mean?
Well, what it does mean is we're in for tough times as individuals, especially if you're a public servant. At the same time, public servants, you know, the big question at the moment is, why should public servants be getting further pay increases or getting even the same salary that they were getting when so many in the private sector have had to lose their jobs and have had to take massive pay cuts in the past year merely for their businesses to survive? So it's going to be tough. It's going to be very tough, I think, for the average man in the street. Yes, if you've got spare money, the beauty is that you can invest in retail government bonds, lend the money back to the government, and let them pay you 8% per year for the next 5 years, and you can be quite satisfied yourself. But that's not a very constructive solution for the overall country. But as an individual, if you've got spare money, that's exactly what you can do right now without taking too much risk. You just lend the money to the government that is obliged to pay you a very high interest rate, and you solve the problem that way.
Thank you very much. I think with everything else, having had COVID-19 this year really plunging us downwards from where we were already as a country, I think it's safe to say that as individual households, it is our duty to ensure that we spend what we can in the most way that we can at least be efficient with our funds. Those that are entrusted with the state purse should also do the same. I mean, if the amount of money that goes through wasteful expenditure by public service servants, as per the AG's report, if that can also be kept, and of course corruption, and those are behavioral individual decisions that, as much as we're looking at the bigger structural economy issues with policy, with international borrowing and investors. Those are things that we can control, and they're things that perhaps at the bigger macro level cannot be in our hands. However, we do pledge that each individual really assist in driving economic growth in this country. I think we'd like to thank you very much for having come through. You are the last one for this year, and we close with the news that says the next years are going to be as tough as this year. And however, we do look forward to leadership to guide the economy of the province. So we'd like to thank you as Moses Kotane Institute to say this is not the last time. We'd like to have you and literally give us the insights into what we hear and not understand. I think today is very clear for everyone where the country is going, and we'd like to thank you for your expert input on this lecture, Dr. Edwin.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.